This year, millions hit the streets across the world to protest the climate crisis. In this UpFront special, I'll ask two prominent activists from indigenous communities and the developing world whether we're winning or losing the battle against climate change. It's an issue often overlooked by politicians and the media, but the United Nations says climate change poses a potential threat to the very existence of indigenous peoples. Well, indigenous Mexican-American activist Shiva Martinez has been campaigning against climate change since he was 6 years old. As a teenager, he's given speeches at the UN, headlined a town hall with Senator Bernie Sanders, and is even suing the US government over its inaction on climate change. He also helped organize the September 2019 global climate strikes, which brought together almost 8 million people. And he joins me now from Boulder, Colorado. Shiva Martinez, thanks for joining me on UpFront. You've called the climate crisis the battle of our generation's lifetime. And you also say it's disproportionately impacting poor Black and brown communities. How so?
So if you look at a very simple, literal experience for many communities of color and indigenous communities across the planet, everything from the extraction to the transportation of fossil fuels to the impacts of flooding, droughts, displacement from our homelands, superstorms, all of those impacts are more likely to be found in marginalized communities, in poor communities, because at the root of the climate crisis, it's about a lot more than just the environment or energy. It's actually about many of these systems of oppression that date back to colonization that have created the space from which this crisis has grown. So really every part of the crisis is directly connected to social justice, to racial justice, to the human rights violations that are happening.
And given all that, do you think voices from indigenous communities have been fully heard on this most important issue of our lifetime?
It's crazy because the popularization of the conversation around climate has reached a place that I've never seen in the last 13 years of my work in this movement. And now more than ever, there is a recognition of the need of indigenous communities, voices being at the forefront. I don't see a holistic representation yet, because for us it's about a lot more than just being recognized as victims of the crisis, but more so as proponents and as pieces that are going to bring integral knowledge that is going to guide us into the future. Indigenous communities have carried the knowledge and wisdom of living in balance with the planet, with nature for generations, and so for us it's not just being acknowledged as the victims, but also seriously a part of the conversation of how are we going to get through this, how are we going to build the future that we know is possible, and I think we have to do a lot better job of ensuring that representation.
In terms of young activists, a lot of people, especially in the West, have given a lot of credit to Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish activist who spoke at the UN in New York recently. Has she become the face of your movement?
Yeah, I believe that in a lot of ways, from the media to the public perception, Greta is definitely the person I'd say with the highest profile on the planet that's focus is on climate work, climate justice, and has done a lot of good. You know, it's certainly done a lot of good in the projects and the Fridays for Future, the mobilization of millions of young people. It happens at a very necessary time where we are very quickly running out of time. Her voice is incredibly powerful and necessary, and at the same time it's needed for her to give space as well to young leaders on the front lines, even more so than me, that are on the front lines putting their lives and their bodies on the line every single day to protect their communities from fossil fuel expansion.
Because what you said about climate change disproportionately impacting poor Black and brown communities, given that, does it make sense for a white European kid to be leading the charge on this?
Yeah, a lot of people aren't happy about it. You know, a lot of people in our communities and in different Native communities and organizing communities are, you know, frustrated that it is taking, you know, a white, you know, European girl from a very rich Scandinavian country to get the attention that we so deserve on these issues that our people have been speaking up and fighting against for dozens of years, for generations, honestly. And so there is, I think, not that there's a problem, I think, with where she comes from, but I do believe that she is very humble. In my connection with her, when we've worked together in New York, she is very humble, and I think she does understand her place in this work. And so I think it's also lending that opportunity and that platform to other youth as well.
A lot of right-wing critics have accused kids like Greta of being puppets who are too young to know what they're talking about. Some have even accused Thunberg's parents of child abuse. and using her as a tool to promote fear. You've been campaigning with your parents on this issue since you were 6. How do you respond to this argument that children are being used as pawns in this struggle?
I mean, these critics must not talk to young people very often, or must not engage with youth, because we are far more intelligent, aware, educated than most people are giving us credit for. We are the most diverse generation in history, the most educated generation in history. For us, this is a matter of survival, not just 100 years down the road, but this is really, we are understanding that this is what the next 10 years are gonna look like. For high school and university students, this is us understanding that the climate crisis is gonna shape the job markets we're gonna be entering. It is gonna shape the way that our economics will be functioning. So we have, I think, a very holistic understanding that many of these conservative critics are failing to see. This is not us, taking cues from our parents to say certain things on air to get attention. No, this is truly about one of the most defining issues of our time. And if you look back at different eras of the civil rights movement, of different social justice movements, people fighting for their survival, young people fighting for their survival, for their rights, that was never questioned, And now for us, that is that same struggle in a much larger way because it is so global. So many of these critics, have a hard time understanding the crisis at all, understanding what climate change is. But for us, this is about our world. This is about not just our future, but what our impact is going to be today.
You talk about your future. Do you agree with Greta and others when they say that for young people, your childhood is being stolen? It's being taken away from you. And do you feel an extra burden that you have to bear, an unfair burden that you have to bear for raising this issue that affects your generation more than it does other generations?
Yeah, that's why we do this. We take up this sacrifice so that generations in the future will not have to suffer the way that we have, will not have to hustle and struggle. And, as Greta, me looking at Greta when I first met her, I saw her and I had such big brother vibes, wanted to protect her energy because of how I saw already her being very weighed down by this work. And I've been there, I've been burnt out, I've been exhausted, I've been depressed and apathetic because of these issues, because of the impending disaster that is hanging over our heads every single day. Many young people in my generation are experiencing that climate anxiety, and it is taking away so much of what our time and our energy is, but it is a sacrifice that is absolutely necessary so the generations in the future have the opportunity to live lives that are equitable and just and sustainable.
You've taken legal action against the US government on climate change, which I want to discuss in a moment. But before I get to the legal action, what's your view on civil disobedience, on breaking the law to draw attention to climate change? Because the Extinction Rebellion movement, for example, in the UK, even in the US, has taken non-violent action to disrupt people's daily lives. They've been willing to be arrested and jailed, but they've also upset a lot of the public who don't necessarily agree with those tactics.
I think anybody who is coming from a place of dismissing other people's tactics, saying that their way is the only right way, I think is a foolish, narrow-sighted approach to this work. It's not just about going vegan. It's not just about demanding political action. It's not just about marching in the streets. I think the solutions that we need are very holistic, and I think more so than Extinction Rebellion, which is rather new, I look to different movements of nonviolent civil disobedience, like movements at Standing Rock, like movements to resist the Keystone XL pipeline, like indigenous communities that have been practicing civil disobedience long before the existence of Extinction Rebellion as a successful tactic to defend our communities at the front lines of climate impacts. I believe it is an absolutely necessary piece of the puzzle. It is not everybody's way. Not everybody has to engage in this movement in the same way, but we do have to support those that are doing it in the way that they know best.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Communities, civil disobedience.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You sound skeptical of Extinction Rebellion.
Not skeptical. I just like to give credit where credit is due and acknowledge that nonviolent civil disobedience tactics have been happening for generations. I support Extinction Rebellion, what they're doing as well, but I believe that it's a lot deeper than just the work that they're doing in the climate space.
In terms of legal action, back in 2015, you and 20 other youth activists sued the US federal government in a landmark climate change case for their inaction on climate change. What would winning this case in a court of law actually achieve in concrete, practical terms? What would change if you won?
Right. So it's been wild. We've been pushing this case through, attempting to get to trial for 4 years now. The demand, what we are asking is that the courts enforce a prescription for a climate recovery plan to be implemented at a national level to reverse the climate crisis to the point to remove carbon in the atmosphere to the point of returning back to 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it would be a very long procedure and process of working with the courts to enforce a climate recovery plan that would be drawn up by a team of the world's leading climatologists and climate scientists to restore the balance of the atmospheric composition. So that would mean everything from changing energy infrastructure to massive reforestation and carbon sequestration.
You filed another lawsuit when you were only 13 years old against the fracking industry in your home state of Colorado, but you lost that case earlier this year. Isn't the problem for movements like yours, especially from a marginalized community like your own, that it's near impossible to go up against the power, the wealth, the lawyers of the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, we lost this case, but honestly, even seeing the federal suit and seeing how we have endured 4 years of trials and tribulations where the Trump administration is doing everything in our power to throw legal loopholes in our way to keep us from going to trial, and we have overcome every single time. We are continuing to see the support from the justice system of allowing this case to move forward and get closer and closer and closer to trial. So yes, we are against some of the most powerful entities on the face of the planet, but now is a time where I think the power of people is being recognized as an unstoppable force, both with the mobilization of bodies on the streets, the mobilization in our courts, the way that we are taking to the polls. There's a lot of momentum, I feel, that is going to change the landscape of what we have seen possible, because for us, like, this is such a monumental tipping point that it's the masses are going to need to be activated and be involved in really shaping the future and not allow it to be written by, lobbyists and bought out politicians.
And so on that note, do you feel like you're winning or losing this battle? Because on the one hand, the head of OPEC has warned that climate activists like yourself are, quote, the greatest threat to the oil industry going forward. On the other hand, you yourself have said, I hope I don't have to do this forever.
Yeah, I mean, in my lifetime, I would like to see the tide change. And I don't have the rest of my lifetime to ensure that to happen. We don't have the next 80 years to slowly make incremental changes and slowly change policy at a small level. This is going to really require a massive amount of very quick mobilization from governments, from corporations, from everybody in the next 10 years. So I think the next 5-10 years are going to determine a lot as far as our involvement in what we fight for, and whether it's reversing the climate crisis or surviving it. And we shall see where that takes us. I'm optimistic, and I believe we have a lot of power. I believe that our generation has a lot more power than these corporations would like us to believe, and we are scaring them, and we are showing that we are not just in the streets, but we are also changing the political landscape of the conversation around climate. Every single year, we are seeing more and more people stepping up, demanding action on climate change in the political space, as well as individuals and corporations. So things are changing very quickly, and they're going to need to amplify and ramp up those efforts. I believe that our generation has the power to ensure that our voices are included in the way that the future is determined. The question is, will it happen quick enough? And I'm hopeful. I think we're here for a reason. I think that everything our ancestors sacrificed and fought for us to be here today, like, we are here to do this work, to leave something really powerful behind.
Shutezka Martinez, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Much appreciated. Cheers.
Born in the foothills of the Himalayas to a forest conservationist, Indian environmentalist Vandana Shiva is one of the world's most renowned activists, taking on big multinationals like Monsanto and Cargill and championing the idea that our planet's future depends on farming systems that are focused around women. Originally trained as a physicist, Vandana Shiva has written over 20 books and served as an advisor to both NGOs and the Indian government. She's been described as a rock star in the global movements against climate change and genetically modified organisms. And she joins me now from New Delhi. Vandana Shiva, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Hello, Mehdi.
When it comes to climate change today, who or what is enemy number one in your view?
Climate change, of course, isn't a person. It's the result of actions of irresponsible actors, primarily the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel-derived industrial agriculture, including the poison cartel they created, a handful of companies that started in Hitler's Germany, moved on to sell chemicals, the pesticides, the fertilizers. So I would say the problem is chemical, industrial, fossil fuel-based farming, and the solution is ecological, biodiverse farming in the hands of small farmers.
Given that India is the world's third largest emitter now of greenhouse gases after China and the United States, how much support do you think there is in your country to take on climate change and make the kinds of sacrifices and cuts to emissions that are absolutely and urgently required to avoid a climate catastrophe?
Well, for the tribal who's fighting against big corporations to stop coal mining, it's not a sacrifice to not have more coal.
Yes.
For the peasants fighting against Monsanto, their GMO seeds, the tractorization of this land, the debts that have resulted in 300,000 suicides, it's not a sacrifice, it's a defense of their lives. What the young people on the streets are talking about, every Indian tribal peasant woman is talking about. So the rush for coal and fossil fuel is really a corporate enterprise.
But Vandana, a Gallup poll last year reported that 77% of Indians are satisfied with environmental efforts. Are they wrong to think their government is doing a good job?
Well, I think we need to be looking at the movements that are growing around the country. There's an urban forest for which people have been fighting in Mumbai. There are people fighting against the destruction of catchment forests everywhere and against the destruction of wildlife and forests. There are huge movements that realize there's a link between the biosphere and climate change. And they're defending the earth, the soil, the trees, and the animals, including human beings.
Just from a global perspective, some Indian environmental activists have called the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Agreement a, quote, cop-out, because it, quote, erases the historical burden of the rich countries and that it's bad for India, bad for the world. Would you agree with those statements?
Well, it was in Copenhagen that the binding emissions for the rich countries was dismantled. And President Obama got together 5 countries and said, let's have voluntary commitments. So Paris really was picking up the ruins of Copenhagen. Yes. And that is why Evo Morales said, I'm going to defend the rights of Mother Earth, not the rights of the polluters, and created a group on the rights of Mother Earth. That really is the future. That's the Green New Deal, a new pact with the earth, a new pact to live better without fossil fuels, without chemicals, without poisons.
So from an Indian perspective, though, is Paris bad for India from that point of view, from that worldview?
Well, it is bad for India only in the sense that it equates all polluters, the historic polluters who for 200 years have been pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in excess of its recycling capacity. But voluntary commitments on environmental crimes are wrong in any case for everyone. Yes. These are environmental crimes. And we had a treaty that created structures to regulate the emissions in a legally binding way. We'll have to come back to the issue of legal obligations to protect the environment, the biodiversity, the climate, yes, the water, the oceans.
And should those legal obligations reflect what you just mentioned a moment ago, which is the historic responsibility of certain countries, industrialized Western countries, for those emissions? I mean, not all countries were created equal when it comes to carbon emissions.
Well, you know, industrialization, which was based on colonization, of course, has a historical burden in terms of the damage being caused by the colonizing countries. But I am among those who believes that we don't have to follow that path because, as Gandhi said, God forbid that India should take to industrialization after the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island kingdom, England, is today keeping the world in chains. If an entire nation of 300 million at that time, now 1.3 billion, took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare of locusts. It's 150 years of Gandhi. It's time to remember there are other paths than the industrial part. There are other parts than the parts of empire.
When you say there are other parts apart from the industrial path, a lot of people in India will say to you, it's easy to say, but this is a country, India, which has had massive growth over the last few decades, has lifted millions of people out of poverty. They've done that through economic growth, through industrialization, through emitting carbons. And they might say, you know what? A lot of people are alive today who wouldn't be alive today had we not taken that growth strategy. What do you say to them?
Well, you know, poverty in our country used to be measured in terms of how much do you eat. Today, if we measure the issue of hunger and India's status in the hunger index, we're not doing too well. The indices of poverty measurement keep changes. It changes from calories to consumption to spending money. I think there's only one true measure. Are people eating or are they not eating? And Indians are not eating too well with the kind of growth that is being measured. After all, if you don't measure the production by people and you say in the measure of growth, if you produce, you don't produce. If you're consuming what you produce, that means every circular economy, every self-reliant economy, every women's economy is ignored and turned to zero. That's why we have a hunger crisis. That's why we have an ecological crisis. It's not enough to measure growth as the circulation of profits and the extraction from the earth and from society.
You have a Prime Minister in India, Narendra Modi, who was re-elected this year, who likes talking about growth and about profits. Do you think he's doing enough to take climate change seriously? He wins lots of awards for his environmental record. What do you think of his record?
Well, you know, the ones who give awards are the ones who know why they're giving awards. I personally think there's a foundational flaw in growth. It was a measure created for war. It is not a measure for peacetime. It's not a measure for well-being. That's why I work with the government of Bhutan, which says we'll measure gross national happiness.
So what grade, if you were marking Narendra Modi, what grade would you give him in terms of fighting climate change?
I'm not a school teacher. I don't give grades. I live my life.
Okay, let me rephrase the question. How well do you think Prime Minister Modi is doing in terms of fighting climate change?
Well, if the measure is how much more solar and how much more wind power you have grown, of course, India is making huge contributions. But I think we have to reduce the infrastructure that was built for the fossil fuel empire. We've got to learn how to have better lives with a lower ecological footprint.
What do you make of the Green New Deal that's been championed here in the US by the likes of Senator Bernie Sanders and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a potential solution to the climate crisis? Is that something you think that can be replicated internationally, even in countries like yours?
We need a global conservation core. We need livelihoods linked to regenerating the earth, not to destroying the earth. And we do need a Green New Deal with the earth, remembering that the earth is alive and we have to work with her laws, her processes to protect her species diversity, avoid the sixth mass extinction, and avoid climate catastrophe. All this is doable, all this is possible, and a Green New Deal is a survival imperative.
On this show back in April, I interviewed the famous NASA climate scientist James Hansen, who's a hero to many environmentalists, and he said that the Green New Deal is, quote, nonsense, that we need a real deal which understands how economics works. What do you say to James Hansen?
Well, I would say we need a new deal that is truly green and knows how ecology works and how nature works. And economy is a subsidiary of ecology. Both are derived from the same word, oikos, the earth, our home. If we have to do good economics, it has to be economia, the art of living. It has to be based on the laws of nature. That's the revolution that we need. It's the revolution I'm engaged in.
And one last question. You were born in the foothills of the Himalayas. A report earlier this year found that at least a third of the Himalayan ice fields are on track to melt as a result of climate change. That would impact almost 2 billion people who rely on the mountains for water. What is your message to countries that aren't on track to meet the bare minimum promises that they made in Paris, given that perspective?
Glaciers make our rivers perennial. Without glaciers, what we will have is seasonal rivers and rivers in flood in the monsoon and dry in the rest of the season. For those who are ignoring the crisis of the third pole, it is like the island issue, islands submerging under sea level rise. These are issues of climate justice. Climate justice is the foundation of climate action. And that is why the polluters must pay.
Vandana, Shiva, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you, Mary.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next year.